She opened her door to two iced-over puppies. What they led the police to next would shock the whole town. If you like stories where a single act of kindness turns a life inside out, hit like and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Martha had measured out her days like teaspoons of tea. Routine, small, careful. Each morning the same round of chores. The wood stacked just so beside the back steps. A kettle set on the stove before the sun had edged the trees with silver. The old rocking chair by the window turned toward the road, as if she still expected someone to come back along it. Snow had been falling off and on for 3 days. Fat, soft flakes that muffled the world until sound seemed to belong only to the house. It made her think of everything she'd lost and the things that refused to change. Grief, like the weather, had its seasons. Her little cabin sat on the far side of town, where the road narrowed and then gave up to forest. The grocer's van came twice a week, and the mailman stopped if the drift by the mailbox didn't reach his bumper, but otherwise life flowed in a quiet loop. The radio low in the evenings, the kettle's sigh, the slow creak of the porch in winter. Martha kept count of small comforts, the thickness of the blankets, the way the panes fogged when she made soup, the neat stack of newspapers by the chair. She was 80, widowed for a decade, and the ache in her chest had settled into something like a familiar chair. Not welcome, but known. On the third night of the storm, after she had banked the fire and read until the lamplight felt dim, the whimper came. It was so small at first that she thought it might be her own old bones complaining. Then it came again, a thin, persistent sound, at the edge of hearing, like someone knocking at the glass. Martha left the lamp by the chair and went to the door. Snow pressed against the threshold in a fat, almost affectionate weight. She opened it, and the cold pushed inside, carrying with it the smell of wet fur and the faint metallic tang of something else beneath it. An odor that set her teeth on edge, but that she couldn't name. On the top step, curled as tight as they could make themselves, were two puppies. Their fur was matted with snow, their ribs a whisper beneath their skin, eyes too bright in the lamplight. One lifted a trembling face when she moved, and the other began to whine in a way that felt like asking for an entire life. They were tiny, no bigger than her own forearm. Martha had never expected anything dramatic. She had never expected company. She pulled the door closed on the wind and the storm, and set about the work of saving them, like someone who had been saving herself by routine for years, and now found, to her surprise, a different kind of task. She wrapped them in the blanket that had been folded on the chair, ran water until the kettle sang, and rubbed at their paws with a towel. The little bodies were so cold they nearly hardened beneath her hands. When warmth reached them, when their tiny muscles loosened, they breathed in a way that made Martha's throat tight. One nuzzled into her wrist, warm and trusting, and for the first time in months she felt a softness in her chest that wasn't grief. She fed them from a saucer, pushing it to the floor and watching them lick at broth as if it were a draught from some small secret spring. Outside, the wind had the rhythm of an old song, steady and not unkind. Inside the cabin, light pooled on the wooden table, and shadows leaned back as if listening. Martha talked to them, simple things, the sort of small domestic directions she used for herself. Stay here, be quiet, eat. The names came to her without ceremony, Rose for the brindled one, and Pip for the smaller, bark-faced companion. She laughed at the sound of their names. The laugh surprised her more than anything else. They slept in her lap that first night, small and immediate as a single keepsake from the world. Martha sat in her rocking chair and watched the fire, feeling the room grow tight with an almost holy contentment. She realized how certain she had been in the last years that solitude was the only honest thing the world would offer her. And then these two fragile things had come and opened the room inside her that she had previously kept locked. Morning arrived with a pale, brittle light. The storm had passed but left its sharp attention on the landscape. bones of trees, fences draped in frost, the road a white ribbon. The puppies were restless, noses to the air, ears pricked in a way that suggested they smelled a world she could not yet see. They moved with a purpose that felt almost like intention, little bodies tremulous but determined. Martha folded her lap blanket and, with the care of someone dressing a newborn, planted their paws on the wooden floor. Pip pressed against the back door, and Rose pawed at a corner where the porch met the house. Their whiskers twitched, as if listening to a truth the wind carried. She had not taken more than 2 steps toward the sink when a knock sounded at the front door. 3 slow, measured taps that landed like a stone into still water. It wasn't the kind of knock you expected in town, where the grocer would call and leave packages on the porch. This was deliberate, practiced, every tap measured by breath. Martha's hand found the doorknob, and the puppies fell into a strange watchfulness at her heels. For a moment she considered opening the door. Then she thought of the stove unlit, of the smell of their wet fur filling the house, and she closed the latch and turned the bolt. There was a pause, so long that her own pulse seemed loud enough to fill the room. And then voices. A man's voice, low and the sort you heard over a radio when they gave instructions in half sentences. She couldn't make out the words. Footsteps crunched away, then returned, closer now, as if the person had circled the house. A bright white light slid under the doorframe and across the rug, and the puppies recoiled, low growls hiding in their small chests. Martha wrapped her hands around the kettle like an anchor and sat down. She thought of the photographs tucked into the top drawer, her husband in uniform, younger than she'd ever seen him again, her son at graduation, faces that had since developed the soft edges of memory. She thought about the smallness of her hands and the unexpected violence of fear in the middle of the day. She had never been one to call the police for noises in the night, storms, teenagers, the county. She had learned to live with the creaks and the moonlight shifting on the floor. But there was an urgency in the way the light moved beneath the door that felt unfamiliar. It made the electricity at the nape of her neck stand up. A car rolled up the lane as a silhouette across the snow, tires hissing in the thin crust. Red and blue strobes blinked over treetops like distant warning beacons. Voices reached her through the panes, careful and practiced. Sheriff Dalton introduced himself through the door. There was a steadiness to his voice that seemed to carry the weight of a life spent listening for people who had made bad decisions. He asked if anyone was inside. When she answered, she could hear the suspicion in his question dissolve into relief. He said they'd had a call from the highway, a report of a man matching a suspect's description walking toward the woods, and that deputies were canvassing the area. She considered the puppies. The thought of them shivering on the porch if she opened up and stepped into the wind made her hands shake. She told them she would open, and she did, but only halfway. Through the crack, Dalton was a wide-shouldered man who carried his hat under one arm until he was asked to put it on. His eyes lingered on the puppies. "You keep those inside," he said simply, as if the instruction applied to everything he kept close in life as well as the animals. He asked her the questions he always asked. Had anyone been by? Had she seen anything? Martha answered about the storm and her kettle, about the chair by the window. She did not mention the ache that had fed her finer habits. Deputies fanned the property with an efficiency that made Martha feel like the center of a wheel. They placed cones of light into the bush line, and the puppies, who had been dozing, awoke and moved with a new energy. One of the deputies, a woman with a braid that slipped from a hat, crouched down and held a gloved hand out. Pip nosed it and then turned, as if the glove was a part of the map he had in his head. The deputy smiled, but there was a question in the curve of her mouth. She followed the line of the puppy's sight to the side of the porch where the snow had been disturbed. "Boot prints," one of the deputies said. His voice held the practiced flatness of someone cataloguing things that were not surprising to them, but that still required attention. He knelt and brushed at the edge of the drift, revealing a dark streak in the snow. It wasn't a puddle, it was something more stubborn, a stain that made the breath shorten in the cool air. Martha felt it before she saw it, a small, bright shame of recognition, like a scraped knee gone pale. The deputy's glove came away with flakes of something that glistened, but the light did not make it sparkle like ice. He bagged the swatch in plastic, with a ceremony that felt both small and huge. Forensics would be called, Dalton said, measuring his words, but not here and not in a way that implied the day would resolve in a neat motion. They set a perimeter. 2 deputies moved to the ravine edge, and then to the trees beyond, their boots leaving a path like punctuation across the white. The puppies pressed their noses into shingles, into the crack where the porch met the house, as if they were reading a language invisible to human eyes. When Rose began to paw at a place beneath the porch, an old board that had been loose since winter, she watched debris part, and something small and hard revealed itself. A thud of metal, the corner of a battered wallet, then a flash of a badge she did not recognize. The pendant slid free with a damp sound. Martha felt her hands go cold against the saucer she'd set down 5 minutes before. She had the sudden, ferocious tenderness of someone looking at something that belonged to someone else and realizing how fragile ownership could be. The deputies opened the porch board with gloved fingers and pulled out what had been tucked there. A small package wrapped in an oilcloth, a pistol the size of the palm of a child's hand, and a handful of items: cash, a cloth stamped with a logo, and a stubby, blood-dark strip caught in the folds. There was a hush. The world seemed to tilt on a hinge toward the woods. Someone called for gloves and evidence bags. Dalton's face, usually a steady plane of practical concern, tightened in a way that made Martha think of storms she had watched gathering in the creek behind the house when she was young. He took a breath that looked like a promise and spoke low to the deputies. "This changes things," he said. The puppies stood at attention, as if hearing the same thing. They were not dogs that wanted to be heroes. No one had time to be heroic in this sort of life, but their noses had led them to a place where human hands had tried to hide what they should not have hidden. There was no magic in it, just instinct sharpened by survival, and that instinct now pointed like a compass toward trouble. More vehicles arrived then, tires crunching with the precision of an orchestra arriving for a performance. A deputy set down a coffee beside Dalton's elbow and was thankful for the small, shaking warmth. Martha watched them move with a curious detachment. Her living room, which had been a stage for solitary rituals, now hosted a choreography of gloved hands and small, efficient conversations. The puppies circled at Dalton's boots, sniffing at him the way they sniffed at everything new. Even in the middle of an unraveling, they were small creatures trying to learn the outlines of a world. They found more traces, leading away from the porch into the trees. A length of frayed rope snagged on a low branch, a scrap of torn fabric that matched the damp strip, and a print pressed into the snow with a pattern that made one deputy frown. It was fresh and heavy. Someone had moved through here not long before. Dalton's jaw worked as he considered the map the animals were making of the property. Entrance, cache, exit. The deputies exchanged looks that meant they had long ago learned how to read such maps. At some point, someone asked Martha to step back into the house. It was a formality, but also a safety measure. She felt the gentle pressure of law at her shoulders and moved to the window. From there she saw the line of people, uniformed and steady, moving like hands over a body. The puppies now on the porch whined low and impatient. They wanted, plainly, to be with whatever lay out on the white. Martha put her palm to the glass and felt the bite of cold through the pane, as if it were trying to reach her. Deputies set up a temporary command beside the pickup, tables, a small radio that crackled with static, the kind of mundane equipment that, stacked together, felt like armor against something none of them wanted to be fighting that morning. Dalton asked the deputies to follow the trail into the ravine. But he did so with the measured caution of a man who had seen the way a precarious plan could fall apart when a single, unexpected thing happened. An animal, a landmine of ice, a desperate person. He spoke into his radio to call for backup and an EMT on standby. Forensics was requested. They needed to mark the scene, document the evidence. Everything they did made sense, evidence of a department that had survived long winters and had learned the rhythm of crisis. The puppies, impatient and sure-footed, slipped past the quiet barrier the deputies had set, more curious than afraid. Pip darted forward and vanished beneath the low boughs like a comet. Rose followed, tail a thin temper of motion. One deputy reached to scoop them back, but Dalton held up a hand. He watched the animals go, the way a man watched a conversation between two things he could not control. "Let them," he said. "Animals lead. They see things we miss." They moved along the animal-made trail that threaded the trees. The snow beneath their paws left a spattered path that marked them like punctuation. The deputies followed in single file, breath clouding in the cold air, guns holstered but within reach, gloved hands ready for anything the woods might offer. The map of the morning altered with each step, a broken branch here, a smear of darker snow there, a patch where the leaves had been disturbed as if something large had dragged its weight across the ground. Martha watched until she could no longer make out more than the occasional glint of a boot or flash of reflective tape. She stood in the doorway, the house behind her an island of warmth, and felt the cold reach for her in ways that were not only physical. The puppies returned after a few minutes, noses white with dust and a stubborn look in their eyes, then turned like hounds who had found a scent and could not ignore it. They pawed at the earth of the yard, where the trail led outward and toward the ravine. Dalton returned a moment later, his breath fogging, and there was something in his face that told her the simple story was already complicated. He did not hurry his words. He told her calmly that they'd found stolen goods and a weapon tucked under her porch, and that they had reason to believe the person responsible might be nearby, wounded perhaps. Martha listened the way one watches a television playing at a neighbor's house, close enough to hear, not close enough to interfere. "Could I help?" she heard herself ask before she had time to weigh the foolishness of the question. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. When she had been younger, she had been practical in ways that made men rely on her. Now, hearing her own voice ask for a role, she realized it was a kind of hunger. Dalton considered her like a man assessing the wings and bones of a gull. "Will this bird fly?" He stepped back and into the light so that she could see the lines around his mouth. "We need you to stay inside for now," he said. His tone had the warmth of a man who wanted to protect without infantilizing. "This is dangerous. We don't want you in the line of fire." The puppies pressed against the screen of the door, whimpering, their eyes pleading. Martha felt the electric thread of connection between them and the world outside, between her and the world she had once navigated without wonder. She thought of her husband, of the afternoons they had spent trimming the hedge, of the time they'd chased down a stray that had wandered into the orchard, and the way kindness had always been a small thing stretched into a lifetime. The idea of sitting quietly while something violent was nearby felt impossible. It would, she knew rationally, be reckless, but she also felt a new, unnameable responsibility. The puppies had come to her, and now perhaps they had come to more than that. She bent and picked up Rose, feeling the tiny rapid pulse under the fur, and cradled her like a child. Pip nosed at the hem of her coat, insistent. Dalton's gaze softened. "You should let us do our job," he said. "We can't have you out there." "I can't be in the house," she said. "If something happens out there, if they're trapped—" "It's not about you," Dalton said. "It's about keeping you safe." His words were sensible, but they sat on the table between them like a bowl of hot soup cooling, necessary but unsatisfying. Martha set the puppy back down and straightened. The line of deputies through the trees had become small again, a string of dark beads moving into white. She thought of the snugness of the blanket, of how the puppy's bodies had warmed hers overnight. A strange, dangerous courage rose in her, not the kind that storms gates or plays for headlines, but the domestic courage of someone refusing to close the door on the thing they have just begun to love. "Give them a whistle or a command," she said. "Pip will come back." Dalton hesitated, and for a breath the world felt suspended. He had to decide whether to treat Martha like a danger to be kept inside or an asset whose intuition might serve them. He sent a deputy back for a whistle, the sort used to call working dogs. The puppy trotted in when he heard it, ears perked, tail a metronome of hope. They were animals of habit and scent and small loyalties. Dalton watched them with a new respect. The deputies moved deeper into the ravine. The trees swallowed sound until all that remained was the distant scrape of boot against branch and the low, purposeful barking of the dogs as they threaded through underbrush. Martha stood at the door of the cabin with her fingers pressed to the wood, feeling the pulse of the world move from house to field. She thought, absurdly and horribly, of how many times she had baked bread for people who never came, how often she had mended coats in a winter of strangers. The thought of small mercies seemed newly luminous. Small acts, she found herself thinking, get counted in ways you can't always foresee. An hour later, when the vertical sun had arranged itself into a sharper angle and long shadows cut the yard into bands, Dalton came back with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He wore his hat now, and his face had the tired look of a man who had been given a problem that would not be solved with mere presence. He explained that a deputy had found a trail leading toward the ravine and that the dogs had pinned it to a hollow where the snow was trampled like a handprint. They had called for an EMT and K9 backup, and forensics had been notified, but more worrying was the blood on the strip of cloth. They'd bagged it, and someone had suggested it might be human. The word hung in the air, heavy as a bell. Martha's world narrowed to the size of the porch. She thought of the small round of a man's face, the posture of a person who had been in a scuffle, a stumble. She had the animal understanding that wounds bled where the body was weak. The puppies leaned into her knees as if to say, "We found it, now what?" Dalton looked at her with an expression she couldn't read, then asked if she wanted someone to drive her into town, to let neighbors know. She surprised them both when she said no. She wanted to stay until she understood what these dogs had found and where it might lead. She wanted to be present, not because she expected to be useful in a tactical way, but because presence felt like a final measure of respect for those who had been put through harm. She was old enough to know that if you had room in your heart, you had responsibility. The puppies had come to her because outside they had nowhere safe to be. "All right," Dalton said at last, making a concession to the stubbornness of the human animal. He motioned to a deputy to keep her in sight, but not in arm's reach. "If anything looks off, you come straight inside and you let us handle it." She nodded and watched them file back into the trees, a procession moving toward a place that had suddenly become the epicenter of danger. The air tasted of winter and of something metallic that made the back of her tongue twinge. The puppies did not tire of looking where they'd looked before. Their attention was a kind of insistence. Martha felt the old ache that had been a part of her for so long begin to shift into something that felt like purpose. She stepped out onto the porch, letting the cold slap her cheeks into ruddy color. Snow gathered along the hem of her coat and melted into the fabric, creating little dark halos. She stayed at the threshold, where the house's warmth still clung to her like a shawl, and watched the deputies move like a measured tide into the ravine. The dogs went ahead now with an urgency that suggested they had found not just objects, but the scent of a person. They moved into the denser dark, where the trees leaned together like conspirators. A deputy signalled with gloved hand, and the line tightened. The forest swallowed their shapes. For a moment, the only sound was the shallow, bell-like call of a distant bird and the soft thud of a single boot. Then the dogs returned, as if to test the perimeter, to check whether someone had left a trail that led back to the porch. They paced and pointed with their noses, pushing their muzzles into the snow and at the base of the ravine, their bodies speaking a language of scent and memory. Martha could feel something watching. It was not the forest. It was a human attention, a presence that made the air feel thick with question. She thought of how easy it would be for someone injured to hide in that scrub, how a man might curl himself into a depression under boughs and try to become a shadow. Images, too precise and too intimate, came unbidden to her. The surprise of a stolen wallet, the panic of a man running with a limp, a sudden flinch that leaves one hand stained on fabric. Her mind supplied 1,000 possible narratives, each one tinged with the same small, enormous dread. A radio squawked from the deputy's van, high and urgent. Voices were clipped. Someone reported a sighting at the bottom of the ravine. Movement, a shape, then static. A deputy told the others to hold position. Dalton's voice came in with the authority he'd carried all morning. "Slow and steady. We don't know if he's armed. Find cover. Call for medics to be on the perimeter." They moved again, surgical and cautious. The puppies threaded the outer edges, noses to the ground, then darted through a half-closed curtain of branches that hid a small dip in the earth. For a heartbeat, Martha could not tell whether the dogs paused because of scent or because creatures that survive by smell have a particular respect for the damp and dark. Then the dogs started barking, sharp, high yaps that cut the hush. The sound was not triumphant. It was an alarm. A deputy responded with a voice, not a shout, and the forest answered with a rustle. Something moved low and fast, and for a second everyone felt the electric clarity that separates standing from action. The deputies fanned and shouted commands, quiet, measured, ordering the man to show his hands. The trees seemed to hold their breath. Martha stood frozen in the doorway, a small figure framed by curving wood, and watched as the line of men advanced into the hollow. The puppies, still small bastions of life, pressed against the underbrush as if to propel themselves into the center of danger and pull back with something in their mouths, seconds stretched. The deputies were careful, moving in a way that had been taught and retaught, boots finding traction on frozen ground, eyes scanning for glint of metal or the sudden drop of a shadow. A muffled voice came, too low for Martha to make out, but heavy with tiredness. Then faintly, another sound, a sob, a curse, a word that might have been apology. Something in the air changed. The urgency in the men's posture relaxed ever so slightly. A deputy stepped forward with his rifle lowered to the ready and extended his hand, palms open. "We need you to come out slowly," he said, his voice carrying the practiced rule of de-escalation. The puppies went quiet, as if they knew a dramatic moment, and retreated, backing into the deputy's legs. Martha felt the air thin around her. She thought of all the small kindness she had kept folded inside, and of the way that kindness had reached outward in 2 warming breaths of fur. She moved to the edge of the porch, each step a small crunch underfoot, and felt the cold reach her bones. From somewhere under a tangle of boughs, a figure rose. He did not come up with a swagger or a wildness. He came up slowly, holding his hands where they could be seen, his shoulders hunched, as if the pain had wrapped itself around his ribs and would not let him stand tall. He was younger than she expected, maybe 30, maybe younger, face shadowed by a hood crusted with snow, a beard that had grown patchy and wild along his jaw. He moved with a half-hobble, and when he lifted his hands, they were streaked with something dark that might have been blood, but only gave suggestion of violence rather than the thing itself. Martha's throat closed at the sight of the man. She recognized in the small tilt of his head the same raw exhaustion she'd seen at the edges of her own sorrow. He looked at the officers. at the dogs, and then at her. For a moment, his eyes met hers across the distance of a yard and a whole life of choices. The puppies, as if summoned by the recognition of a fragile human need, whined and pressed forward. The man flinched. Dalton's voice cut across the hollow again, solid. "Down, hands where we can see them," he said. The deputies executed their positions with restraint, circling to create a perimeter that gave themselves angles and left the man with lanes to surrender. The man complied in stages, first a slow lowering to a crouch, then a more definite bend that seemed like giving up the fight of being upright. The deputy nearest him moved in to secure. Someone called for an ambulance. Someone else radioed for the suspect to be identified. There was an efficiency to it that made Martha feel oddly distant and then intimately involved in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork. He was taken from the ravine with blankets and calm hands. He limped because of a muscle or a bone that had been betrayed. But he did not fight. Martha felt both relief and a strange apology rise up in her gut. She had not expected to feel empathy for a man like this, wounded, perhaps dangerous, certainly desperate, but empathy was an old friend that kept showing up in her life, uninvited but comforting. She saw the deputy's gloved hand turn a small item over and, in the way that happens in towns, recognized the town's currency. A wallet that had been reported stolen a few nights earlier from Mr. Hargreaves' pickup, a receipt from a gas station miles away, and the stub of a note that suggested panic. But the story was not yet closed. As the man was helped to the awaiting vehicle, a deputy reached into his coat and drew out a small, folded paper. He looked at it, then at Dalton, then down at the man's hands. The puppies, little engines of scent and stubbornness, pressed close, and one of them draped a paw against the man's boot, as if to claim him. It was a tender humor in an unraveling, and it made Martha ache. Dalton came up the porch steps and stood before her with a patch of shadow on his face, carved by the brim of his hat. He spoke quietly, the kind of voice that a person used when they wanted to convey both thanks and a shield against the enormity of an event. "You did something right tonight," he said. "You saved them, and they led us to him." Martha nodded, as if the words were some small flint of meaning struck in the dark. She thought of the puppy's breath warming her hands, of the way she had wrapped them like secrets. She considered, too, the way the town would reframe the story. The old widow who went out in a storm, the bright-eyed puppies that became little local saints. She felt an embarrassment at the thought, a reluctance to be the center of anything. And yet it was true. Her small act had been the hinge for a chain of cause and consequence that had led to the capture of a man who had, by the looks of it, been running through his own private winter. Dalton's eyes were steady. "We'll need statements. Forensics will be back in a bit. There may be more to dust for. We'll keep the dogs here. If you want them to stay, we'll make sure they get what they need until we can arrange." "They're mine," she said before she thought about the humility of claiming something that had arrived suddenly and unannounced. The words felt like a lock closing on a cupboard. Martha had never imagined that she would speak like that again, definitive, owning. She had not spoken it for herself in a long time. Dalton allowed a smile that was small and fond. "If you can take care of them, we'll write it up as a find," he said. "We can't formally gift department property, but we'll make a note of who rescued them. For now, get them dry and fed. We'll do the rest. And Mrs. Keene—" "Martha," she corrected gently. "All right, Martha. Thank you." His voice had a respect that made her feel like an equal, and in a town where everyone knew each other's faults, that was worth more than a medal. They returned to the house in a line of cautious activity. The deputies collected what they needed from the porch, gloved hands folding familiar protocols into the soft geometry of the morning. The puppies made themselves at home inside drawers of coat and underchairs, pressing their warmth into the furniture like a claim against the cold. Martha dried them with a towel until their fur shone faintly and smelled of soap. She set a pot of broth to simmer on the stove, as if resuming a domestic habit that crime had merely interrupted. The radio played a small, steady station that used to be her husband's favorite. But the morning had not ended. Inside, with the dogs fed and sleeping in a sun patch on the floor, she sat and tried to collect herself. The world outside continued to hum with the low sounds of a small town responding to a disruption. People would talk. The grocer would have a story to tell. The papers would file it with an economy that made no promises about justice, but that took care to note who had been present. Martha, who had lived most of her life outside the drama of headlines, found her life had slipped into one. It should have been a neat ending. 2 rescued puppies, 1 man apprehended, a sheriff grateful. But when Dalton returned later that afternoon, heavier and quieter, there was something about the way he carried a paper-clipped folder that suggested the morning had left shadows in places they had not yet illuminated. He placed the folder on her table and tapped the edge with a finger. Inside were photographs of items retrieved from the porch and from the ravine. A blue scarf torn into strips, a receipt with a time that did not accord with the suspect's story, a small anonymous key that curled in on itself. "There's more than just the robbery," Dalton said. "This man's been on the move. We linked some of the items to a series of break-ins along the county line. We need to know if anyone's been in your yard lately, if you've seen someone hanging around." She told him about the mailman, about the grocer's twice-weekly stops, about a neighbor who had been out to chop wood earlier in the week. She told him, too, about the small way her son had called less often than he'd used to. The practicalities fit together like puzzle pieces, and still left an image missing at the center. Dalton's tone shifted to a softer register. "You did exactly what you should have. You kept yourself safe, you kept the dogs warm, and you let us follow their lead. That's heroism of a quiet kind." Martha did not feel like a hero. She felt instead like a woman who had finally done a thing that made the world notice her in a way that was not only about age or loneliness. She had been useful, and usefulness coaxed back into her a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire on the hearth. She folded her hands in her lap and listened to the puppies breathe and the distant hum of the town settling back into itself like a blanket. Outside, the snow had begun to slump into a softer stage of its life cycle. The sharp edges had rounded. In the trunk of Dalton's cruiser, the deputy had set a blanket over the man's shoulders. He had been given a room at the county with a hospital bed. He would be questioned and processed and whatever else the law required. But as the afternoon mellowed, Martha kept returning to the thought that the morning's events were less about the end and more about the beginning of a story that had unhooked something in her. She warmed the puppies against her chest and let Rose curl into the crook of her arm like a slow sigh. The cabin, once a theater for solitary routine, seemed to be hosting an unexpected congregation. Neighbors who had paused on their own errands to ask if she was all right, a deputy who came by with a thermos of coffee and an offer to fix the loose board that had sheltered contraband, and a reporter from the regional paper who promised to be unobtrusive. Martha listened to these small interactions like a person absorbing a map of neighbors. She felt gratitude, yes, but deeper and stranger than that, a recognition that kindness could move in circles she had not anticipated. She thought of the man from the ravine and how his eyes had seemed to ask for more than condemnation. Mercy and justice tangled in her mind, and she did not try to separate them. Night fell with a hush that felt like a benediction. The puppies slept in a mound on the rug, breathing in rhythm like 2 small clocks. Martha let the kettle go cold as she stared at the faint smudge on the porch where the officers had lifted evidence and patched the boards. She traced patterns in the wooden grain, like a divination, finding in the whorls and lines nothing quite as clear as the morning had been, but something that promised movement. There were loose ends that left a taste of copper in the mouth. Dalton had said there might be more to the case. Other break-ins, other people who had handled the stolen items. The man had been taken in, but the implications of his capture reached farther than the ravine. There were questions about motive, about where he had been, and whether he had been running alone or for someone else. People like to think a single arrest wraps a story in neat paper, but reality often left tales open to the wind. Martha poured herself another cup of tea and held it like a warm secret. The dogs stirred and raised their heads, ears shifting toward the sound of a car on the lane. In the distance, lights pulsed once and then again. An ambulance, a patrol, the slow roll of tires as the town reorganized itself around the unscheduled urgency. Night kept its promise of cold, but inside the cabin the warmth felt durable now, as if the morning had permanently shifted something in the walls. Martha watched the watchful little chests rise and fall, Rose tucked under her arm and Pip sprawled against her knees. Her hands had the faint smell of broth and fur. They trembled sometimes when she realized what had happened, and steadied other times when she remembered the tiny, eager mouths at the saucer. The day had gifted her a strange exhaustion, the kind that comes after a long, necessary labor, spent but strangely satisfied. A knock at the door made her start. It was Deputy Ortiz, who had a way of carrying small kindnesses in his pockets. A thermos lid, an extra pair of gloves folded into his coat. He stepped in with a careful nod, brushed snow from his shoulders, and set down a paper cup on the table. "Sheriff asked me to tell you he's at the station tying up some things," he said, voice low so as not to wake the puppies. "But he wanted you to know. Everything you did mattered." Martha sipped the coffee with a thin, grateful smile. The heat warmed her from hands to chest, and she found she could breathe a little easier. Ortiz lingered, then cleared his throat. "We found more, Mrs. Keene, not just the cash and the wallet." He unfolded a small plastic evidence bag and placed it on the table between them. Inside, folded with gentle exactness, was a bit of embroidery. Delicate stitching in faded thread, a locket on a chain, a child's tiny bracelet. They had seen a fair number of things over the years that belonged to other people's histories, but this kind of recovery pulled at a particular place in people's chests. Some of these were reported missing from a home down in Cranberry Hollow, Ortiz said. "We'll be calling them to confirm. We wanted you to see it before anyone else." Martha's fingers hovered above the plastic, reluctant to touch the past tethered there. She'd always kept a small drawer of things, buttons, a faded ribbon, a letter tied with string, and though the objects were ordinary, they were portals to other people. In the quiet that filled the cabin, she allowed herself a thought that felt like both sorrow and solace. If these things could be turned back to where they belonged, then whatever pain had followed the man from ravine toward her porch might be softened a little. "People will want to talk to you," Ortiz said gently. "If you don't want to, tell me. We'll do it without dragging you into it." She shook her head. "I'll tell them what I remember," she said, "but nothing more than that." The words surprised her with their calm. She realized she wanted to help in this small, exact way, to let the story be recorded properly, so that whoever's bracelet or locket sat in that plastic would be one step closer to returning to its owner. Over the next few days, the rhythm of normal life returned around the edges. Forensics teams came and took measured photographs and made gentle notes in little black books. A detective came by to interview her about timelines and odd sounds, and to ask if anyone else had been near the lane. They were careful with their questions, respectful of her age and of whatever strain the morning had taken from her. Dalton stopped in each evening, less in the formal mode of a commanding officer and more as a neighbor who'd watched the way isolation can settle on someone like dust. He brought sandwiches once and stayed long enough to ask about the puppy's diet and whether she wanted supplies. Word moved through the town in the patient way small places have. The grocer stopped to leave a braised chicken on her porch, wrapped in foil. Mrs. Hargreaves, whose truck had been relieved of its wallet, came by under the pretense of checking on Martha and cried a little on the porch steps when she saw the puppies. "You have no idea what that bracelet means," she told Martha through a handkerchief. "My Evelyn left that with me when she went away to the city. We thought—" Her voice broke and she did not finish. The return of something so mundane felt like the writing of a small moral world for her, as if a thread had been found before the sweater unraveled. The reporter who had said she would be unobtrusive did as promised. Her article ran modestly in the regional paper, a tidy paragraph about an act of mercy leading to the capture of a man connected to a string of burglaries, a photo of 2 puddles of fur asleep on a worn rug, and a quote from Dalton praising ordinary citizens for their quick thinking. The framing was careful. No one wanted to turn Martha into an oddity. Still, the piece put the cabin and its occupant into a new orbit. Friends called from across town, and a woman from the church offered to send over warm blankets. As the days lengthened, the investigation grew legs. The items taken from beneath the porch matched reports from 3 different properties along the county line. A throw from a farmhouse on Old Mill Road, a kid's watch missing from a camper, a necklace absent from a dresser in a little mobile home by the river. It gave detectives a pattern, not an industrious mastermind roving neighborhoods, but someone opportunistic and erratic, moving in cold sweeps when weather masked his steps. The man taken from the ravine, once processed and questioned, admitted to a series of break-ins driven by hunger and a mounting desperation that had curdled into worse choices. He said he had been hurt during one of those attempts and fled, moving blindly until his body demanded hiding. The confession did not erase harm, nor did it make the objects good, as if nothing had happened, but it helped fill in the spaces where facts were needed. Police found a few more things in a burned-out trailer off County 7, items that matched Mrs. Hargreaves's missing trinkets, the kind of evidence that stitches stories together for jurors and for victims alike. The county prosecutors prepared preliminary charges. Forensics would take time to complete DNA and prints, and the detective cautioned against expecting quick answers. "It may be weeks," he told Dalton, "but this is a big step." Martha was not interested in the mechanics. What lingered for her was the human smallness that made such uprootedness possible. Hunger, the numbed thinking of a man whose nights had frayed. When she visited the station to give a formal statement, she lingered as Sheriff's Clerk Martin read parts of the report aloud. She listened for the names of items returned, and when she heard the child's bracelet mentioned, it felt like a small bell pealing in the middle of a long, fogged morning. Being pulled into public view was awkward for her. A neighbor snapped a photograph from across the street and posted it with an awkward caption that made Martha laugh in spite of herself. People left handwritten notes in her mailbox, thanking her for the dogs. Children from the school came by with drawings that showed 2 small dogs wearing capes. The attention was clumsy but earnest. A town reshuffling its habits to make room for gratitude. The sheriff arranged for a brief, low-key meeting at the town hall. It was not a ceremony, there were no plaques or press releases, but a gathering of neighbors who wanted to say thanks and to offer practical help. A neighbor volunteered to cut her wood for the season. Mrs. Hargreaves brought jam. Another neighbor offered to run errands. Dalton stood in the back, hat in hand, and told the small crowd quietly that ordinary choices had kept everyone safer that week. "Not all heroes wear uniforms," he said, and the crowd laughed and clapped in the modest way small towns do. The puppies settled into the new routine as comfortably as people could. The sheriff dutifully noted the rescue in his reports, found animals placed into custody of resident, and the department technician arranged to have them checked by a local vet. They were microchipped during a short, cooperative visit in the back of Dalton's cruiser. The vet chuckled about their names and remarked on how quickly they'd bonded to Martha. "They choose their people," the vet said, and Martha, in the privacy of her kitchen, let herself believe it. Days melted into a comfortable loop. Martha cooked more than she had in months. She found herself making 2 plates sometimes, leaving one with a neighbor who taught art at the community center. She began to mend sweaters she had left in odds and ends. The physical act of repair suited her fingers, and in the evenings she sat not merely to watch the road but to watch the 2 small warm bodies at her feet, listening to the contented rhythm of their breaths. They had, without grand ceremony, reshaped the contours of her days. Yet the case remained something of a weight in the town. The man from the ravine had family, a sister who came forward in a conversation that was half apology and half explanation. She had been estranged and lived 3 counties over. The legal process would take its time. People debated at the post office and in line at the grocer whether punishment or help was the right course. Martha found herself listening more and talking less, watching the way the town's moral compass spun slowly toward consensus. That a mixture of accountability and support served justice better than posturing. One afternoon, a month after the storm, someone from the county prosecutor's office arrived with a small cardboard envelope. Dalton was with them, and his face carried that particular gravity he wore when small stories had larger implications. He handed the envelope to Martha and said, "This came from the detective. There was a note. They wanted you to have it first." Inside was a photograph, glossy and small, taken by a woman called Evelyn Hargreaves, the very Evelyn whose bracelet had been found. The photo showed a little girl in a blue dress, the bracelet on her wrist, laughing at something just out of frame. On the back, in faded pen, someone had written, "For when you forget what joy feels like." A separate letter, typed and folded, told a short story of loss and the slow work of putting pieces back together. Evelyn wrote about how the bracelet had been given by a grandmother who'd passed away, and how losing it had felt like losing a memory. "To know it's home," she wrote, "is a kind of miracle, though I know you don't like that word. Thank you to the woman who kept 2 small lives safe, long enough for a town to remember its better self." Martha held the photo like a talisman. Tears came then, sudden and hot, and she let them. They were not performative or enumerated. They were the raw currency of relief and of belonging. She realized, in a way that felt new and bright, that whatever lonely habits had taught her, measured days, careful lunches, the soft count of grief, had not ended so much as been rearranged. Someone else's memory now lived on her shelf. Word of the photograph spread slowly. Evelyn came to the cabin with her son, a young man with kindly eyes, and the reunion that ensued was awkward and beautiful in real proportion. Evelyn hugged Rose and Pip in the kitchen, while her son talked with Martha about the ways small towns keep each other's losses. They left a thank-you pie on the sill and promised to bring the family over for Sunday coffee. For Martha, it was another recalibration. The house had been a diorama of solitude, and now it held more voices, small and intermittent, like new furniture placed to fill once empty rooms. Spring began as it always did in their part of the world, slow, uncertain, then suddenly green. Snow retreated from the road in slatted ribbons, and the trees returned their first tentative leaves. Martha found pleasure in small labors she had once called chores, the planting of a window box, the sweeping of a porch that now bore the scuff marks of 2 small paws. The puppies grew into youthful, joyful dogs who loved to press their noses to the window when the mailman came. Pip developed a habit of sitting on the stoop and watching the road. Rose preferred to patrol the garden like a tiny general. There were invitations now. A neighbor asked if she would join a weekly coffee clatch at the library. She accepted once, then again, surprised by the ease of it. The sheriff asked if she would come by at times to visit the department, not to be asked anything of consequence, but so that the people who'd spent bitter nights outdoors had a place to bring the 2 dogs. She found she liked seeing the deputies in a life less full of emergency. They were different men and women when they were not on call, tired but with room to laugh at office jokes about bad coffee and colder nights. Once, right after supper, Martha took the puppies on a short walk to the edge of the woods. Pip barked at a squirrel, while Rose sat and watched the sky. The air was sharp with the smell of thaw, and there was a sound, very faint, of someone a long way down the road starting up a tractor. She walked with her hands in front pockets, feeling the old stiffness loosen. A neighbor named Harold came out with his dog, called a lab with a tail that shattered the air with friendliness. "You doing all right?" he asked, and Martha realized she had started saying yes without the reflexive addendum of "for the most part." It was not that the old hurts were gone, they had simply been rearranged into a larger mosaic that included kindness and possibilities. Months later, the legal processes moved as such things do, deliberately and with pauses. Charges were filed, hearings scheduled. The man from the ravine faced the consequences of his choices, and the town discussed the rightness of his accountability. Martha watched from the periphery, more invested in the quiet reclamation happening on her porch than in the headlines. When the case concluded temporarily, with a plea that included community service and mandated counseling, options the prosecutor argued were measured to both protect the town and address the underlying desperation. Some people cheered and others scowled. Martha, who had never been a lawmaker, found herself thinking of the little bracelet and the frightened man who had found himself more lost than wicked. She felt an odd calm at the idea of practical help mixed with legal consequence, as if the town had not chosen a simplistic justice, but something more complicated and, in its way, humane. The season turned fully toward green, and one evening when the air held the honeyed promise of summer, Dalton stopped by with an envelope and a small card. He sat at the kitchen table and folded his hands. "The department wanted to do something," he said. "Nothing formal, just a little acknowledgement. People wanted to show appreciation." Martha opened the card. Inside, in neat script, was a note from the deputies. "To Martha for kindness and courage when it mattered most. Thank you." A small, laminated photograph had been tucked in. Dalton, Ortiz, the deputies who had worked the ravine, all holding Pip and Rose like props at the edge of a stage. They looked less like lawmen in that picture, and more like exhausted people who'd been allowed a moment of lightness. She felt briefly and oddly shy. The card found its place in a drawer alongside the old photographs. It was not the declaration she would have wanted or shied from it, but it settled in like a small, warm stone in her pocket. Life, in the way that life insists on doing, went on. She developed a modest routine, mornings at the bench near the window, afternoons of mending and kindness, evenings spent with two small heads on her lap and the radio murmuring. The community that had gathered around her in the volcano of the storm did not vanish. Neighbors dropped by more often, not out of obligation, but because the thread connecting them had been rewoven. The grocer brought over discount coupons for pet food. A retired teacher from down the road offered to walk the dogs when she needed to run to town. She found herself becoming part of a mesh of small favors that made days easier and more textured. One quiet evening, with the porch light pouring a friendly circle across the path and the puppies snoring like tiny engines, Martha sat in her rocking chair and thought of the night they had arrived. She remembered the sound of their whines, thin as a threshold, and the way her heart had opened in an instant that felt like fate, but was simply choice. She had offered shelter on a stormy night, nothing grander than that, and the choice had multiplied. It had led to the recovery of other people's memories and the capture of a man who might, with help, find ways to be less dangerous to himself and others. That was the real twist, she thought, how one small act of compassion could ripple outward in ways that didn't always look like a single dramatic reveal, but instead like a series of connected human responses. A sheriff's steady hands, deputies following a scent, a town bringing back a bracelet to a laughing girl, a man set on a path that might include help. The shock the headline had promised never came as fireworks or a sudden public reckoning. The shock was quieter, The ordinary world, rearranged by an evening's choices to accommodate more care. Outside, a car drove slowly past, and when the driver saw the porch light and the dogs, slowed further to honk a greeting. The wheels made a soft hiss in the street. Martha lifted a hand, and the driver waved back, and in that brief exchange she felt the kind of belonging that was small and stubborn, and in its own way permanent. She poured a fresh cup of tea and let it cool while Pip stretched and Rose blinked awake. When she spoke to them, her voice was low and folded in affection. "Who brought you here?" she asked, though she knew the answer. The night, the cold, two small lives that had needed a lap and a saucer to find a harbour. They nudged her palm insistently, as if to say the same thing the sheriff had said earlier. Kindness had been enough. Martha tucked a note into her pocket, one from Evelyn, thanking her, and turned the lights down. The house hummed with small life. The creak of a chair, the soft breathing of two dogs, the distant cadence of town at rest. If anyone asked her later why she had opened the door that night, she would have said simply that she could not bear the sound of the wine. That answer would be both true and incomplete. The fuller truth was that a woman who had spent years arranging herself for solitude found, in the shape of a warm body and the sound of shivering breath, a way back into a map that included other people. That acceptance became, over the weeks and months that followed, the place from which she lived again. From time to time, someone would ask if the dogs had saved the town. Martha had learned to smile at grander versions of what had happened, and to answer in the exact smallness she preferred. "They found some things and led some people to us," she would say. "They did what dogs do. They followed smell and we followed them." And when listeners pressed for the twist, the part the papers liked to call shocking, she would offer them what everyone who had been there knew. That shock was not a single moment, but a braid of choices. A widow's kindness, the animal's instincts, the deputy's caution, and the community's willingness to care. Each strand mattered. The puppies grew into dogs who loved the back lane, the smell of Mrs. Hargreaves's roses, the rhythm of people coming and going. They slept at the foot of Martha's bed and took up the poor end of the couch when company arrived. Their presence softened the edges of days that had been sharp with habit. They were, in that small domestic way, proof that the world could be coaxed into new shapes. A note of thanks came years later from Evelyn, whose child was now old enough to remember the bracelet and tell a story about a stranger's kindness. She wrote of how that small recovery had altered the family's grief into a narrative of return. Martha kept the note folded in a book on the shelf and reread it sometimes, like a weather report from better days. On an ordinary afternoon, when the light tilted just so and the old rocking chair remembered its cadence, Martha would look up from whatever mending she had taken on and watch the dogs curl around her feet. She felt not the old hollow of loneliness, but a steady contentment that contained the private knowledge of what had happened on a certain stormy night and the ripple it caused. It was quiet and it was large. If you were to stop by the cabin now, you would find two warm furred bodies greeting you at the door, a kettle on, half for ritual and half for the invitation, plates waiting for unexpected guests, and a woman who had learned the gentle, mutating power of a small kindness. You might leave with a pie and a story, or you might leave only footprints in the snow outside. Either way, the house welcomed you. The dogs snuffled at your coat. The rocking chair kept time. And if, in the end, there was a final message in this story, it was not a moral shouted from a high place. It was a simple fact. One small, ordinary act, opening a door to someone in the cold, had altered several lives for the better. That was the twist. The shock was not in spectacle, but in the way ordinary compassion could rearrange an entire town's evening into a softer, kinder morning. If this moved you, share it with someone who believes in the quiet power of kindness, and consider opening your heart, or your home to a rescue. Comment below where you'd welcome a pup like Pip and Rose, and tell us about a small act that changed your day.